Did Jesus get mixed up in politics? Should Christians be involved in politics? There's a new book we're going to be talking about today by Wayne Grudem, Politics According to the Bible.
Vantage Point is brought to you by American Vision. For more about today's topic, check out the best-selling book, The Christian Life and Character of the Civil Institutions of the United States. You will find it at AmericanVision.com.
On my right, Gary DeMar. On my left, Joel McDurmon. Gentlemen, let's talk about this new book, which had great potential, but dropped the ball.
Well, first of all, I'm thankful that Wayne Grudem has decided to take up the topic. That in and of itself is something
Brave.
To be commended.
Right.
Oh, and brave, because he's talking to an audience that typically does not get involved politically. And I know there's been a lot of fanfare about this particular book. When I wrote my God and Government series, the 3-volume God and Government series, which came out in 82, 84, and 86, there really wasn't much from the evangelical community on this subject. You had John Eidsmoe's book, God and Caesar, and then actually a really quite a good book by Robert Duncan Culver called Towards a Biblical View of Civil Government, which I think is very helpful, and because it's more narrowly focused, I think it's a better book. I think Wayne Grudem tries to cover way too much material, and as a result,
it's obvious.
He's essentially created a textbook
for the evangelical community, and it's a problem.
And that's going to be a big problem.
And anybody who doesn't deal with who deals with politics and attempts to deal with Christian Reconstruction, which is what I want to talk a little bit about today, and doesn't deal specifically with Rushdoony's Institutes of Biblical Law, to me, just has not done an adequate job. So there's one particular place in here, and Brandon, if I can take that and read it, he deals with the whole idea of America as a Christian nation, and he makes some very good distinctions. This is on pages 64 and 65. And defining what it means to, for a Christian nation. And I think that's one of the problems that a lot of advocates of a Christian nation don't do. They don't define terms, and he does do that. And then he has a section here, what about Old Testament laws? The question of theonomy. And theonomy simply means God's law, and it was popularized by a book in the early 1970s by Greg L. Bonson called Theonomy, which was a master's thesis that Greg had done at Westminster Theological Seminary. It was later published by Presbyterian and Reformed Publishing Company and caused a huge stir. When I was a student at Reformed Seminary, Greg Bonson was a professor there, and there's a great deal of debate going on over that particular issue, and it still exists today. And Grudem does have a very short section here. It's not even a full page on theonomy and Christian Reconstruction, and he makes this comment. He says, there is a view among a few Christians in the United States today called theonomy. It's also called Christian Reconstructionism, sometimes dominion theology. Critics have labeled it dominionism, which has echoes of jihadism.
That was a stretch.
I will use the term theonomy, which is a general term used in theological critiques of this movement. Theonomists argue that the Old Testament laws that God gave to Israel in the Mosaic Covenant should be the pattern for civil laws in nations today. Joel, I have been doing this longer than you have, but you've certainly been involved in this as well. Really, theonomy is a subset of Christian Reconstruction. Christian Reconstruction
Absolutely.
is much broader. So kind of give the audience a definitional explanation of the similarities and distinctions between Reconstruction and theonomy.
Well, like you said, Christian Reconstruction is a much broader movement. I think it brings in eschatology, the idea of a progressive advance over time. It's post-millennial generally. Theonomy is not necessarily that. Theonomy just deals with the aspect of God's law and the aspect of civil law within God's law. And that's an aspect, that's another distinction that doesn't get talked about a lot. When this is brought up, the first thing that usually comes up is, well, how can you make a law against covetousness and stuff like that? How would you impose that on people? That would just lead to all kinds of tyranny. Well, I mean, that's not the claim at all. The claim of theonomy is where the Old Testament gives a civil law, then we should apply a civil law. Where the Old Testament does not give a civil law, we should rein in government and not let it affect those areas. And of course, if you apply that standard, you're going to have a much freer, smaller government than we have today by far. But more to your question, it's just the aspect of the broadness. Christian Reconstruction is a much broader view. It talks about family and culture and things like that. Theonomy is just dealing with civil law and how we should understand it today.
In Christian Reconstruction, we talk about Christian Reconstruction. I mean, I've been working on a fairly extensive article, and I'm dealing with something related to Mormonism, nothing to do with Glenn Beck or Romney, just something else. And just to show how other people have misrepresented Christian Reconstruction, this particular fellow, Ed Decker, who's a former Mormon, he says, thus Mormons, like Kingdom Now theologians and Christian Reconstructionists, believe that they can bring in a kingdom of political righteousness here on earth and offer it to Jesus when he comes to reign.
Right.
Now, like I say,
and I can make a list of people who have represented us in that way without ever providing a single quotation from any source.
Exactly. I mean, if there's one thing we don't believe, it's that you can change a society politically. In fact, someone sent me a little video clip today. I was on Rushdoony on the issue of dominion, and dominion and Christian Reconstruction are often used as synonyms. And I mean, there's one thing that Rushdoony was against was the belief that you can change a society from the top down, change the thing at the political side, and then everything at the bottom is going to change. That just doesn't happen. You can't impose upon a society what people in fact don't want.
Absolutely.
And my 3-volume God and Government series is really a takeoff of a single chapter in one of Rushdoony's book, I think it was Law and Liberty, where he talks about self-government, family government, church government, and civil government. I don't see that dealt with very much in Grudem's book, making these types of distinctions.
Yeah, and you can add Grudem to that list of people who's brought up the issue, dismissed it as if, here's its error, now let's move on, without ever quoting a single individual, without ever interacting with him. As far as I know, in any of his academic or published work, he's never dealt with the writings of any theonomists. So, I mean, that kind of dismissal is, well, it's disrespectful. And granted, we are a small number of Christians, as he says, but that doesn't mean that our argument should be dismissed in that way, especially if you're going to make it a point to address the issue. You owe it to the reader and to the thousands of Christian students who are going to be using this as a textbook. You owe it to the reader to say, here are the resources, here's what they say, and here's why I think that's wrong. But there's no interaction whatsoever.
Yeah, he does.
That's disappointing.
Now he does reference Institutes of Biblical Law and makes no reaction to it. He does reference theonomy and Christian ethics, but instead of letting these authors speak for themselves, instead, he goes to Vern Poythress's book, The Shadow of Christ in the Law of Moses, and gives the page number, said, if you want a critique of theonomy, go to this book.
Right.
And yet, he really doesn't deal with this. Now, I want to take this a step further, because he kind of dismisses the idea of the Old Testament law, but yet when you turn to page 217, he has a section here on marriage, and he says, incest, adultery, and homosexuality are prohibited in biblical ethics. And he quotes, here's the quotation, incest is prohibited in Leviticus 18:1 through 18, chapter 20, 11 through 20, verses 11 through 20, Deuteronomy 22, and then he goes to 1 Corinthians. And then, of course, adultery was regularly prohibited in Exodus 20:14. And he lists these Old Testament laws.
Right.
So I'm confused.
Yeah. So when are we going to use these for norms for society, and when are we not going to use them for norms of society?
When he deems.
When the theologians who, might take my job if I don't agree with them and they have a better position, when they use Old Testament ethics, then I'll dismiss them when it's controversial and on the fringe, so to speak. But when I need the argument, I'll go to Old Testament law. So it's a classic argument we've always put forth. I mean, is bestiality okay by their standard, by their dismissal of Old Testament law? Is bestiality okay? Why would it not be? There's no New Testament prohibition against that. And there's no New Testament prohibition against many things. And we could make a list of those things. But no, the basics of biblical ethics are in Old Testament law. If you don't start there, you lose a lot. And where do you start? And why? I mean, there's a whole range of questions these guys don't address, and they just dismiss us on the one hand, but then turn around and use what we would use on the other hand. So it's completely inconsistent.
How do you handle some of the harsher punishments that are meted out in the Old Testament that we would consider by today's standards?
Well, that's the question. Why is today's standard considered loving? Why is it considered loving and tolerant? Why is there this huge virtue on tolerance? I mean, adultery destroys cultures like nothing else.
Families and people's lives.
It is one of the ultimate evils, and homosexuality is basically an exaggeration of that same impulse. It destroys cultures. It does it slowly, granted, but it destroys civilizations. Why is that to be tolerated?
But I know what our viewers are probably thinking. They're probably thinking the Old Testament would call for the stoning of an adulterer, but in the New Testament, Jesus said, "He who is without sin cast the first stone." So,
well, he did that in one instance, and there's a lot to be talked about in there. Essentially, what he was doing was saying, "Where are the two witnesses?" You know.
Yeah, she was. It's very, very interesting.
She's allegedly caught in the act.
She's caught in the very act.
Right.
Well, adultery caught in the very act means.
So where's
the other guy?
There's a partner somewhere.
And so I think the story really needs to be.
Yeah. It needs to be retold. And Jesus was using biblical law to throw the case out of court.
Okay,
essentially.
good answer. Yeah. But I know people will ask that
Well,
question.
I'll give you a good example. I was at Emory a couple years ago and spoke at a political science class, and this young lady said that she wanted to follow the ethics of Jesus, and I said, well, that's a really good starting point since Jesus was following the Old Covenant. I didn't say that. I said, let me take you to Mark chapter 7. Mark chapter 7, Jesus takes probably one of the most difficult passages from the Old Testament relating to the law and punishment, and that is the execution of a rebellious child. And he applies that in the New Testament. And when I showed that to her, it was the first time when I could actually say I saw somebody's jaw drop. Now, Jesus wasn't applying that to little kids. He was applying it to adults.
Yeah.
So,
grown.
So you know, the wisdom literature. We have to understand using wisdom on how to use these particular laws. You have Joseph who believed his wife was involved in adultery, didn't go out and have her stoned to death.
Right.
So there's much more to this. I think the worst part of all this is a complete dismissal of it all, and then to kind of sneak in through the back door and attempt to use this stuff to make a case for their own position, and no one seems to want to notice that. So,
well, thank you for joining us for this episode of Vantage Point. Send your emails and questions to vantagepoint@americanvision.org. Thank you.
For more about the topic of today's show, check out the best-selling book, The Christian Life and Character of the Civil Institutions of the United States. It thoroughly delves into the many historical proofs that America was built as a Christian nation. The ACLU and Americans United for Separation of Church and State have done their best to ignore and stifle the content of this massive compilation of original source material. Don't miss out on this fantastic wealth of information in this 1,000-plus page book. You will find it at americanvision.com.
I feel like I'm just not well prepared for this talk. All right, sorry.
Really?
No. If I'm not ready for this talk.
I'm not ready for anything, pal.
Yeah.